Tag und willkommen to my second Germany vlog. This time we're going to be looking at the creation of Germany 1871 and particularly the constitution of Germany 1871 that Bismarck puts together or helps put together and what it tells us about Germany at that time. So, and there already existed, obviously, constitutions before Germany 1871, and they are used as the template for the actual whole German constitution. So these constitutions that existed for the North German Confederation, for instance, plays quite a big role, and that's really where the idea of the Reichstag comes from. But you can see two strands of thought very much in the German constitution in 1871. On the one hand, this is a deliberately authoritarian state. Bismarck and the Kaiser and the Prussian Junkers have decided to set up Germany under their control, and the constitution is there in part to reinforce that control. So it is set up as a federal country with 25 states involved. Each state has its own Länder, its own parliament, and they are in charge of the the state-run things like education, for instance, and the police force. However, the central government in Berlin is is presided over, first of all, by the Kaiser, the emperor, and he is always the king of Prussia. So straight away, Prussia has a lock on the Reich government. And the Kaiser appoints the Chancellor, who is going to be the head of the government, and almost always the Chancellor doubles up as the Chancellor of Prussia. So Bismarck certainly did through his period. Again, this means that if the Chancellor is not a Prussian Junker, it's a deliberate action on the part of the Kaiser because he feels that someone else better represents him, rather than that being the will of the people, as it were. The Kaiser also has control of foreign policy and commands the army during the war. So again, that sort of militaristic element, which is so important to Prussia, and which is so important to the creation of Germany through the 1860s, remains in the Kaiser's hands and therefore remains in Prussian hands. The other key element of the authoritarian nature of this constitution is the Bundesrat. The Bundesrat is the upper house of the German Parliament. It's sort of a bit like our House of Lords, perhaps a little bit more like the Senate in America. Each state nominates people, each state Länder, each state parliament nominates people to sit in this Bundesrat. But they, unlike the Senate in America, the representatives are in proportion to the size of the state. Now, Prussia was by far the biggest of the states of Germany. It's 60% of the population, I think, and 2/3 of the territory, possibly the other way around. And therefore, it dominated the Bundesrat. It had 17 members of that. The next biggest was Bavaria with 6, and quite a lot of the small states just had 1 representative. Actually, the representation of Prussia in the Bundesrat was not proportional to their size. It actually was fewer than they should have had if it's been proportional. But still, 17 representatives allowed them to veto anything that was brought before the Bundesrat. 14 votes were needed for a veto. So in fact, the Prussians could afford for 3 of their members to be away that day and still have a veto on it. Of course, the small states could gather together themselves and veto things that Prussia wanted, but it was much easier for Prussia to veto things. And what this meant, actually, was that not only could Prussia dominate this assembly, but it meant that the Junkers could dominate this assembly, because these representatives in the Bundesrat were nominated from the Prussian Länder, which in itself was dominated by the Junkers because they still had the 3-tier electoral system, which weighted votes towards the more wealthy. So Junkers ended up being the dominant force there. Junkers, of course, being the Prussian aristocracy whose wealth was derived largely from land ownings, rent and that sort of stuff. So the Prussian Junkers had a lock on their Länder and then on the rat, and that meant that they could then dominate the other states as well in federal matters because of the veto. Conversely, they still retained Prussian control over Prussian affairs through the Länder, and so really this whole kind of authoritarian nature means that the Prussians can dominate the federal government and still kind of get their own sort of Prussianness to their state through the Länder. However, there are liberal elements, progressive elements to the constitution, and they, sorry, and they're important as well. The Reichstag is the main place where these are seen. So the Reichstag is the lower chamber, a lot like our House of Commons, where each representative represents a constituency. So again, there were many more representatives from Prussia than any of the other states. However, these would be elected by every man over the age of 25, regardless of wealth. And they're, of course, voting parties. So although there's a block of Prussian representatives, they don't come from the same ideology or with the same thoughts about what Prussia should be doing necessarily. The Reichstag was involved in the passing of any new law in Germany. So this is quite a progressive thing as well. All men are having a say in this. It's party-based, multi-party based, and they're getting a say in every law that's passed. As of course they weren't the only people that got a say. The Bundesrat could veto it, but nevertheless, all laws had to pass through the Reichstag, and they had some control of the military budget as well. So there was an element of control there too. So this is it's still 1871. There's a fair amount of progressive democracy going on here, but it is weaker than the authoritarian element. They have no say over the ministers that are appointed by the Kaiser. The Kaiser's ministers that he appoints, including Bismarck as Chancellor, they do not have to be, and I don't think ever are, members of the Reichstag. And so it's very difficult, if not impossible, for the Reichstag to hold those ministers to account. Because of this, it does end up being that the parties in the Reichstag, instead of becoming national parties that are vying for power and represent a broad swathe of people in Germany, the parties in the Reichstag tend to become almost sort of like regional pressure groups, that they look to promote the interests of their niche group, whether that be geographical or class-based or religion-based, as in the case of the Centre Party, Zentrum, which was more sort of Catholic-focused. So you get parties that represent different areas of Germany, different classes in Germany, rather than parties that try and represent people across the whole of Germany and capture the vote from all sorts of people. So the Reichstag is a place which shows off the progressive nature of this German constitution, but also illustrates the limits of that progressive nature of Germany. Now, often questions about this era revolve around why it was, or how far it was, that Bismarck struggled to rule Germany in this period, why it was difficult to rule Germany in this period. And of course, the constitution is part of that within this, Bismarck is trying to balance the attitudes of the states against this Prussian dominance. They're not blind or stupid. The states, they recognize that Prussia is the biggest, strongest and dominant party in Germany. So the idea of it being a federal country, for instance, is a way of those states retaining individual rights and individual characters. But that means that, of course, there's a compromise that has to be made. The Constitution also shows the tensions between trying to promote a German identity in allowing all men to vote in the Reichstag and having parties that represent Germany and sort of saying, oh, we're German, we're progressive, but balancing that against the sort of Prussian need, Juncker need for retaining control of Germany. Other problems that emerged in this era are the growing industrialization of Germany, which was happening in the late 19th century in lots of countries in Europe. And this meant that there was an increasing middle class, wealthy middle class, which was challenging that Juncker base for political power, political status and influence, and also a growing proletariat, an urban working class, which tended to increasingly vote socialist. And by the end of the 1870s, this is causing, and then into the 1880s, beyond our depth topic, this causes Bismarck quite a lot of anxiety. Alongside that, as we'll see in the next couple of episodes, there are religious and ethnic divisions within Germany amongst people who, amongst Catholics, who Bismarck at least feels are not German enough, and groups like the Danes from the 1860s, perhaps, who've been absorbed into Germany, the French in Alsace-Lorraine, and the Poles living mostly in the east. And all these people struggle to be absorbed effectively into Germany and to feel German. So all of those things, the states' rights, the struggle between liberal and authoritarian natures of Germany, the growing industrialization, and the religious and ethnic divisions create problems for Bismarck during this period and make Germany difficult to rule. Thanks so much. See you next time.